Thank you. In August of 2018, a curious thing happened just outside the Lane Motor Museum in Nashville, Tennessee. A 1992 hobby car, which is a rare French amphibious car, of only which there are 52 in the world, and this one was a particularly rare pre-production model, was being sailed across a lake in a routine demonstration to museum visitors when it abruptly sank. The driver and the passengers were rescued by another amphibious car that the museum had in its collection. It was Amphibious Car Day, and as well as a nearby boat. But the car remained at the bottom of the lake for days until rescue teams could retrieve it. Luckily, the museum's already begun restoring the hobby car to its former sailing and driving glory, but I can't imagine that spending days underwater was particularly good for its diesel engine, and undoubtedly some of the originality of the vehicle will be lost during the restoration process. Another museum with automobiles in its collection had a different problem to solve. In 2001, the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, Michigan, acquired this 1948 General Motors bus. Inside this bus in 1953, Rosa Parks took her stand against segregation and racism in an important event in the fight for civil rights in the United States. However, this bus had been forgotten. It was parked in a field, it was neglected, and it succumbed basically to the elements and to vandalism. Subsequently, the bus underwent a full restoration in order to make it appear as it had in 1953. However, even though the outside of the museum contracted restoration team did everything they could to make this happen, the bus arrived back to the Henry Ford looking, as one conservator told me, looking like a giant toy truck. It was simply too shiny, it was too new in appearance, and it was hard to picture the bus as a working bus as it had in 1953. This is a common problem with restored vehicles. The difficulty of retaining use wear, along with the fact that professional restoration technicians in the automobile world tend to want to make things look better than new. These stories illustrate just two of the issues regarding vehicle preservation, operation, and restoration that museums with vehicles in their collections wrestle with. Vehicles as collections objects are challenging, not only in their unique care requirements, but also in the way they're used and exhibited. In addition, collections managers and conservators working with motor vehicles often have to contend with deterioration issues that are related to a lifetime of use and wear and exposed to weather and the road. However, there have been no industry-wide museum-specific best practices or guidelines to help museum professionals navigate the automotive collections care planning and decision-making. Caretakers at automotive museums have found traditional museum best practices lacking the flexibility to deal with their dynamic automotive collections. I was introduced to these issues as a graduate student in museology at the University of Washington, and while I was interning at America's Car Museum, where I later worked for a brief time. I decided to make these issues the focus of my graduate thesis, and I've continued my research after my program was finished a few years ago to keep working on this problem. In my efforts to compile best practices for the industry and provide actionable guidelines, I conducted research at 7 automotive collections in the United States. The majority were museums, but I included a well-regarded private collection, which is the Bulgari collection, as well as the collections supported by a car manufacturer in Detroit, General Motors. These collections included both restored and unrestored cars, and all operated their portions of their collection to some extent. Through interviews with collections managers, conservators, curators, and a restoration specialist, and through research into conservation methodology and literature, including the restoration of vehicles and of aircraft and museum management of large functional objects, I've compiled a suggested best practices toolkit for dealing specifically with vehicle collections. Though seemingly simple and common sense, best practices are large concepts that must incorporate many possibilities and be meaningful to institutions of any size or budget. My intention is that my toolkit may help fulfill the need for codified guidelines for vehicle-specific museums, and as well as for those who just may have a vehicle or two in their collection. So far, I've shared this toolkit with several automotive collections with both museum and private collectors showing interest in these guidelines. And now I'd like to cover a little bit of background on the topic of restoration and operation within the context of automobiles and within museums. Restoration has long been the norm within the collector car community, and it's the necessary method for bringing a car that looks like this, which is a Buick in the Bulgari collection, to looking like this, which is a fully restored Buick in the Bulgari collection. Nicola Bulgari really likes Buicks. He has several hundred of them. As you can see, restoration completely renews a car's appearance with new paint and a complete overhaul and refurbishment of engine, parts, and materials. However, restoration destroys original surfaces, and if not done correctly, can actually create a sort of fictional artifact. It's an artifact which no longer resembles its original state and is more reflective of contemporary tastes. When this happens, it's often referred to as over-restoration. This tanker truck from the 1940s came back from a restoration shop to the GM Heritage Collection looking nearly perfect. The gaps between the fenders were even, and the fuel door and the body, and the paint is just beautiful and perfect. But this version of the truck is much more perfect than the GMC factory would have made that truck in the 1940s. The tolerances for such details was much lower than it is in manufacturing today. So what does restoration look like? This is a Porsche 907, a race car undergoing a full restoration at the Revs Institute, which is a car museum and research library in Florida. The car has been stripped of most of its parts and all surfaces will be attended to. And this slide more clearly shows how the body of the car is on what's known as an auto rotisserie, which allows a technician to completely turn the body any which way in order to easily access all the hard-to-reach areas. And this is the finished result of that restoration. It's a fully restored race car looking as it did before its first race. Now, many people in the world of automotive preservation feel that operation and movement of vehicles should be utilized to better tell the stories of these machines, whose primary function is really motion. Cars make noise, they give off distinctive smells, and they can give a museum visitor a really immersive experience. Many automobile museums in the United States regularly demonstrate cars for people. I can tell you from experience that riding in a 1930s Ford Model A truck gives you a completely different perspective on transportation in the first half of the 20th century than merely looking at it does. I also drove this 1953 Citroën Deux Chevaux Paris to Peking rally car during demonstration events at America's Car Museum. I know for the Europeans in the audience, this is not that strange of a car, but for many Americans, they have never ridden in one of these. During these demonstration events, museum visitors were given rides around a short track, and we had everything from Ford Model Ts to 1960s muscle cars. We didn't go at speed, but it just gave people a chance to feel what riding in one of these cars was like. However, restoration and operation, they both pose serious risks to original surfaces of historic vehicles that have survived without invasive modification over time. Vehicles specifically like this original unrestored 1918 Liberty Cadillac, which is the only surviving Cadillac of thousands that were issued to U.S. military officers in World War I to be used here, actually. This historic car retains the damage and wear through a lifetime of military service, and there's even a bullet hole in the fender from a trip to the front lines, and the worn seats have never been restored. Even though the deterioration of the upholstery is apparent, the fact that this is the only wartime Cadillac in existence is meant that it is preserved exactly as it is. To restore this car, in many people's opinion, would be to destroy an important historic artifact. Now, to give you a brief overview, the basis of my toolkit can be summed up as the need for creating a comprehensive and specific preservation plan for each vehicle in a collection. And this preservation plan must be built off of 3 interrelated strands of crucial information. Number 1 is an initial comprehensive assessment of the physical condition and configuration of the vehicle, with special regard to original surfaces. Number 2 is an assessment of the significance of the vehicle within a historic and cultural context. Is this a highly original car that is significant due to its condition? Was this car part of a historic event? Is this car an example of a certain model or type of car? Are a few of the questions you can ask. And then the third strand is an assessment of the purpose of the vehicle within the museum's collection. What does the museum intend to do with this vehicle? Is it going to be on static display in a diorama, or will it be included in demonstration events? Is it primarily a tool for education, or is it kind of a historic artifact to be preserved unchanged? Everything in my toolkit relates back to the interplay between these 3 key information points. In addition, every decision regarding a historically important vehicle must assess if the treatment will destroy an original surface and irreparably change the meaning of the vehicle as an artifact. Now, here's a way that I visualize my overall recommendation for creating a preservation plan. Starting with establishing conditions and configuration, we move into research and the significance of the vehicle, which leads into establishing the purpose of the vehicle. And from that, we come up with a plan. This plan may include simple stabilization and maintenance, repair, or perhaps the need for restoration. After the actions undertaken on that vehicle, we can see that the use, which may be static display, operation, or perhaps just storage, it will lead to the need for periodic reevaluation, which can start the process all over again. Of course, the process will be quicker the next time you go through, hopefully. But throughout this system, any change at any point during this process will inform later parts of what you need to do to the car. I'd like to go through a couple of examples from my research to illustrate some of the primary decision-making best practices regarding restoration and operation within museums. This is a Porsche 917 PA race car that was designed for the legendary Can-Am racing series and remains one of Porsche's most iconic and famous race cars. And this particular car was the first of a line of Porsche 917s that came to dominate the series and are collectively considered some of the most important race cars in the world. This particular car was driven by a well-known Porsche driver named Joe Siffert in the 1969 Can-Am season, and this is a photo of that car in 1969. However, throughout the life of this car, since that groundbreaking season, the car had its engine and suspension changed along with paint and other details. Over the 5 years that it raced in the Can-Am series, it continually got upgrades to stay competitive, and it ended its official racing career in a much different configuration and with much better performance than its first season in 1969. You can see here that it's changed in appearance quite a bit. It now has a downforce wing on the back, and it has different bodywork over the wheels. Subsequent owners of this car continue to slightly change it and upgrade it over its life throughout the 70s and 80s. Now, this car is in the collection of the Revs Institute, and which has a mission of preserving important race cars and heritage. After the museum acquired the car, a decision was required as to which primary story to tell in the physical configuration of it. Through discussion of the car's significance, the museum decided that the 1969 version, the first version of that car, was the most important aspect of the car's history, and the changes it underwent later in its racing career no longer reflected the car's importance within the context of historic race cars. The museum then restored it to the configuration of that first picture that you saw, which was a specific race held during that introductory year. They used photos and records to establish the exact configurations of it to a specific point in time. Now, the museum does not want to erase the history of the car, and they have it documented, and they have kept all of the parts that they took off that car, but they would really like to have the car have its most significant configuration. So in this case, the physical assessment of the configuration and the condition of the car, an assessment of the significance of the car as an important first of a series, and the purpose of the car as a part of a collection of legendary race cars, all guided the subsequent restoration. The restoration was then further guided by a reference to a specific point in time, in this case, which is a particular race that the car was in. On the other hand, this is a 1985 Porsche 959 rally car, which is on exhibit at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. This car took part in the grueling 6,000-mile race from Paris to Dakar, Senegal, and it retains damage from that race, including wear to the paint and cracks in the bodywork, as well as this severely cracked windshield. Not only is this car incredibly rare, but it retains an originality that is important. It's an important historic record of that race. In addition, the value to the museum as an exhibit is remarkable. Imagining the view of a desert road at high speeds from inside of this cracked windshield gives the viewer a much different perspective on the risk and excitement of that race. An unrestored car like this makes it easy for me to imagine driving at speed, while some of the meticulously restored race cars that I've seen in many automobile museums are sort of unrelatable in their perfection. And here you can see damage in the lower left corner of that, and damage to the bumper and damage to the paint in the lower left corner. In this case, the originality of the vehicle has been retained due to the car's significance in this condition and valued in the exhibition for the feeling that it evokes. With careful preservation and non-invasive maintenance, this car has remained a historic artifact for its moment of significance. If an otherwise original vehicle is deteriorating in such a way that simple stabilization is not enough, then some form of restoration will be necessary. Here's a 1914 Detroit Electric car in storage at the Peterson Automotive Museum. This car, you can see, has broken windows as well as some body damage. Now, this car does not have a specific story to tell, but it is an example of an early electric car. You can see that the window actually has the possibility of damaging not only the car and interior, but also any technician that works on it. And so it'd be terrible to have these glass shards be retained with this car and have it damage anything. As well, the battery compartment, which is this car's significant feature, has a lot of active deterioration, and undoubtedly some of the metal parts are going to need to be replaced or at least heavily refurbished. However, though it's difficult to tell in the light of this photo, much of the rest of the car is in good shape, so it may not require a complete restoration, simply just a partial restoration. Again, it's the condition and configuration and the significance and the purpose that are the drivers of any preservation plan. Now, how does one go about taking hands-on action with a vehicle? The first thing you need to do is get a good snapshot of what you have. An initial assessment process is required to build an effective preservation plan. The current condition of a vehicle is the important first step of the assessment and decision-making process. The physical condition and configuration of the vehicle inform both the significance and purpose assessments, and everything will come together to make your preservation plan. The initial assessment is also a good time to undertake initial stabilization procedures, which I'll go to in just a second. Now, establishing a condition of an object is a familiar part of many of our jobs, especially those of us who work directly with museum collections. However, a vehicle can prove challenging as there are a variety of materials and systems at play. When a vehicle is going to be assessed, it's important to have a thorough process to establish as much as can be learned about it before you make any definitive plans. The very first part of an assessment is to get an accurate documented snapshot of its condition. Actually, here on the board, I have an example of the assessment process used by the Revs Institute. Now, this checklist has items like measuring brake wear, drawing a diagram of the oiling system, measuring the diameter of carburetor jets, checking the fuel tank for corrosions, and things like this. And the list goes on. I think it's about 45 items. And I include similar condition reporting templates within my toolkit to guide this sort of condition report. Besides the physical condition, the assessment must also be alert for evidence of change that the car has undergone in its past life. Parts that have been changed, added, or deleted are important to note. This is the dash of that Citroën Deux Chevaux that I drove at America's Car Museum. And this car was originally a production car before it was made into a long-distance rally car. So we have the original instrument cluster on the right, and then there's an added feature to the car, which is an extra set of gauges and switches on the left. Now, this is a very obvious change, and just about anybody who gets into the car will notice that everything's written in handwriting on the left. But you need to look for clues to a car's past throughout the car. Clues can hide in very interesting places. This is the underside of a racing seat that was custom made for a certain driver. And it wasn't until they discovered the last name written on the underside of the seat that they confirmed that it truly was that this driver had driven this car back in the 1960s. One challenge regarding cars is their composite artifacts. Transmissions, engines, and suspension parts, and the wheels and the paint can all be changed throughout the life of a car. In fact, the steel frame of the car, or the chassis, is really the only legal identity of the car in the United States and most of the world. As many vehicle lines share similar chassis among models, it is not unusual to have a rare model be faked by installing the parts that make a certain model rare to a much more available, lesser chassis. An important part of the condition assessment is to document serial numbers and patent numbers and vehicle identification numbers. Finding the engine, transmission, and all these numbers on the engines and transmission, it's very important, but it also can be very difficult because there are no standardization as to where these numbers went. So each one turns into a bit of a hunt. It's very common to include initial stabilization activities during your condition reporting. And procedures during these initial stabilizations can better inform your assessment. Stabilization includes changing fluids or perhaps fogging the engine with a film of oil for long-term preservation. Other common tasks are changing worn drive belts, greasing the suspension, and cleaning the car inside and out with special waxes so that various chemicals present do not corrode the paint on the interior. It's important to completely drain old gasoline from tanks and lines, for example, as this gasoline can partially solidify and cause the lines to be blocked and gummed up for pretty much the rest of these lines' life. It kind of fuses to the rubber. Once the fuel is drained, it's important to replace the old gas with new gas that's been chemically stabilized. Simply draining a fuel system or an oiling system can lead to the desiccation of the rubber lines, which leads to cracking and then possibly future leaks, which could be very dangerous as a fuel system. Now, these activities should ideally be done very soon after acquiring a vehicle within a collection, if at all possible, to start stabilizing it as soon as possible. Now, many of these initial stabilization activities will inform a technician more about the condition of the car they're working on. Some of the condition issues can really be only assessed by removing parts, draining fluids, and other invasive activities. For example, if the oil that you drain from an engine during an oil change has metal filings in it, your engine might be about to fail. The color and content of used fluids can be a barometer for the mechanical health of a car. And of course, all stabilization treatments undertaken, as well as any regular maintenance plans for a vehicle, are to be documented as part of the car's overall preservation plan. An important part of this process is to always restore to a point in time. And you want to restore to a known configuration. And choosing a point in time is really the best way to do this. To have a car restored to a person's or a taste or an institution's taste is really to create a historical fiction. For many production vehicles, this point in time is often defined as the moment of completion in the manufacturing process. This is often the case for most production cars that represent a type or a model of car. This is the early 1960s Studebaker Avanti, which was an important car in the U.S. history of car manufacturing. And this one is a particularly important Avanti. It was the very first one that ever came off the production line, and it was held in the collection of America's Car Museum. Now the problem was that somebody had also had this car in their backyard and then painted it with some interesting graphics. And it sort of was taking away from what this car really meant to the car world. So America's Car Museum undertook a restoration, and they took it all back down to original and took it to the picture on the bottom that you see now. This was another example of making a decision about what the significance was, and even though it had a history that was interesting, they decided that its configuration that it had when it first came off the line was kind of the most important part of that car's history. Now, another point in time that a car can be restored to is ownership history. This is a 1917 simplex crane, which was restored to the configuration that it had not when it was brand new, but when it was owned by John D. Rockefeller, who's an important figure in U.S. history. And in the first portion of my presentation, I talked about the Rosa Parks bus. And in that case, the relevant time was when the action in the bus, her famous moment, happened. Now, the importance of research for accuracy cannot be overemphasized. Many restorations have introduced fictional appearances into historical automobiles. This is the engine bay of a fully restored General Motors muscle car. It's the kind of car that's seen huge jump in values and interest in the past couple of decades. And because of that, it's also fostered a lot of restoration shops to really put it into high gear to restore these kind of cars. And now in this photo, you can see a glossy black uniform engine bay pretty much throughout. Here's an example of a similar car from the same era, but this one is in original condition, has never been restored. The engine bay is still mostly black, but the colors vary. The colors of the firewall are matte black, and the various components like the radiator and engine brackets all have slightly different shades of black. And now some of these parts, the reason for this is that these parts were manufactured in different contract facilities outside of the main GM factory. So you can see this first one, it looks nice, but it's more or less a historical fiction. And it was probably restored to the taste of the restorer who just wanted a nice glossy black surface. And this is the original. Now, truly sympathetic restoration takes a lot of research to try to portray the car as accurately as possible. Now, patination, which is the artificial aging of a surface in the automobile world, is generally discouraged, but it can be necessary to treat a replaced component so that it does not distract from the overall display of an otherwise original vehicle. We saw this in example earlier with the Rosa Parks bus. Care should be taken that the patination is done sympathetically to the appearance of an already arranged vehicle, and that the patination is not used to falsify the overall story. This is an original condition Delahaye in the Simeon Foundation Museum, which was missing a leather hood strap. The museum wanted to accurately portray the car as it was when it was used, so it needed 2 head straps as it had originally come. However, when they received it at the collection, it only had 1. So they decided to make a new leather hood strap that they would then patinate in order to make it look like it was from the 1930s, in order to not distract from the overall appearance. At any time, that hood strap can be removed and the car can be returned to original condition. Now, the solution for the Rosa Parks bus that I just referred to was to rub a scouring and coloring compound on the paint to dull its brightness and give it a look of use. And you can see a slight tint of red around the bolt heads in this photo. This was to give the illusion of a buildup of dirt, and Birmingham, Alabama's dirt is famously red in color, so they're trying to make it really look like it was dirty with Birmingham dirt. For the accuracy needed for a museum vehicle, careful consideration of a restoration facility is paramount. Many professional restorers are used to individual taste and owners wanting a certain look, and most are used to perfecting old manufacturing imperfections. It's often a point of pride to make a car look better than new. However, better than new is a historically inaccurate state, so for restoration work done outside of your museum, most museums not having restoration facilities in-house, frequent check-ins and communication to determine adherence to your museum standards is highly recommended, and it's really important to find a shop that will work with you on that. I'd like to talk a little bit about best practices related to the decision-making process about the operation of museum vehicles within collections. As with restoration, the significance, purpose, originality, and condition should all be carefully considered before deciding to operate. For most museums, it's important to remember that these are artifacts held in the public's trust, and to needlessly risk damage to objects is not careful stewardship. The key is to assess whether or not operation will benefit the public in balance to the risks to the historic vehicle. Highly significant original vehicles should not often be operated for fear of destroying the engine or parts, but there are many cars that are not particularly rare, nor do they have a specific story to tell. A Model T is a good example of this. There are still many Model Ts, Ford Model Ts in the world, and many that have had restorations done to them in the collector world. Operating these non-original cars can help tell a great story of mobility to museum audiences, especially if you find one that doesn't have a particular story and that has already faced some sort of restoration. Now for a couple of operation-specific guidelines. All vehicle operations should be documented in a dedicated vehicle logbook. Information collected in the logbook will provide valuable information for servicing, as well as tracking the potential for deterioration and wear to various components of that vehicle. Detailed logbook entries can help the technician troubleshoot problems when they arise, and they can help determine if a vehicle should remain in operation by tracking that car's behavior. A customized specific operating manual is recommended for any vehicle in your collection, not only to inform the current use, but also to ensure that the operation processes may be understood by future caretakers. There's a variety of ways to drive vintage vehicles. For example, Ford Model Ts are shifted using your feet, and most race cars need very high RPMs to run, so it's very difficult to run them at low RPMs. It's very easy to do damage to a car if you don't know exactly how to drive it, and if you have anybody who's going to be on your demonstration team that wants to be a part of that, they need to be fully trained. Another important part is to have an exercise plan. An exercise plan is recommended for vehicles that are intended to be kept in operational condition. Engine surfaces and fluid circulating systems can be damaged by long periods of inactivity. Engines should be brought to normal operating temperatures during regularly scheduled exercise and kept at that temperature for about 20 or 30 minutes. This allows all of the hoses to become elastic and basically exercise their elasticity. Now, if vehicles are to be operated, the public should have some access to experiencing aspects of that operation, either through public demonstration or through audio and visual recordings. Documenting operation is an important part of preservation. Not only does this give the public an experience of the workings and sound of a car, but the car is to be retired from active demonstration, then its operation will have been documented for future generations. Now, all parts determined to be significant to the vehicle should be removed during repair or restoration treatments, and they should be retained and cataloged as associated with that vehicle. And this does not necessarily include consumable parts or parts that are often changed and maybe of modern manufacture, but it's important to keep most earlier parts of the car. Here in this photo, I have the parts storage system at the Revs Institute. They have blue metal Cortec bags, which discourage corrosion. And they use acid-free totes to store all of their parts in. Now, there's another thing to know about restoring cars is there's multiple grades of replacement parts. Best thing to do is to rebuild original parts, but there are several grades available of new parts. Restoration grades are going to look exact, while original equipment manufacturer may be high quality but not exact in appearance. And the kind of parts that you buy at a local auto parts store are generally not going to look the same at all. They may work for you, but they may not be to the standards that you need. There's much more to my toolkit, but I'll end it here. Again, with dealing with cars in a collection, it's important to bring together the condition, the significance, and purpose while creating a preservation, restoration, or operation plan. I'm making my toolkit available to anyone interested as a support for preservation activities. I'm going to hopefully put it on the PACN website, and it's important to, I'd appreciate it if you utilize it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.